What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster, and I want to thank you for joining me for my .95 survival video guide. This guide aims to help you situate yourself in the brave new world of patch .95, the latest content update for 3rd Age Reforged. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a big thank you to both our developer team and our testers. Without everyone's hard work and diligence, we would not have been able to bring you what is, in my humble opinion, one of the best balanced and most content-heavy patches the mod has ever seen. That being said, without any further ado, let's get started. Before we begin with the basics of army creation and encounters and things like that, let's talk a little bit about the new factions that have been added to kind of shake up the meta in .95. First, and I think foremost, because you've really seen a lot of these guys, is the Elves of Lindon. The Elves of Lindon represent the remnants of the Kingdom of Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor, who rode off to war against Mordor in the Second Age and never returned. Based out of the city of Mithlond, the Elves of Lindon are accomplished mariners and warriors. Lindon is a lightly armored elven faction that depends greatly on its pikes and hybrid units. They are at their best in mid-range when their entire arsenal can be brought to bear against the enemy lines, pummeling them with elven archers, javelins, and pikemen. Next up is Rhudaur. Rhudaur is the dark cousin of Cardolan and Arthedain. The men of Rhudaur were once valiant Arnorians, but after their kingdom fell to the Witch King, they descended into savagery, becoming more like the Middlemen than the Númenóreans of old. As a result, Rhudaur is less well-armored than Cardolan or Arthedain, and have lower melee defense than average. They make up for this with a large bonus to their attack stat, and a large number of mid-range skirmishers like Trollshaw Axemen or Herenadine Troll Hunters. Next we have the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. The Dwarves of Khazad-dûm represent the expedition led by Balin to retake the ancient stronghold of the Longbeards, Khazad-dûm. The expedition ultimately met in failure, with Balin being slain by Durin's Bane, and the expedition massacred by the goblins who dwelt in the manses of the dwarves since the fall of Khazad-dûm. But in Reforged, they've been given a second chance to fulfill their mission. The Dwarves of Khazad-dûm are a heavy infantry-focused faction with some of the best armor, shield, and attack bonuses in the game. They also lack a variety of ranged options, having only a single bow and throwing axe unit, in addition to which they lack real heavy cavalry units, contenting themselves with just a few regiments of mercenary cavalry. And last, but certainly not least, we have the Kingdom of Cardolan. The second of the 3 Númenórean inheritor factions, Cardolan has a long and proud reputation of military prowess. Being the second kingdom to be abandoned after the Witch King sent his Barrow Wights to haunt the Barrow Downs and make Cardolan uninhabitable, the warriors of Cardolan suffer from a lower than average morale score, but make up for it with higher armor and shield values than their cousins in Arthedain, in addition to a number of flexible light and ambush infantry options. The courage of the men of Cardolan is further bolstered by their proximity to their elite units, like the Dunedain captains and commanders. Oftentimes, these elite units are the difference between victory and defeat for the Kingdom of Cardolan. We move on now to understanding unit types and what they do. Most units in the game can be broadly grouped into a few categories. Sword and board infantry, one of the most common types of infantry in the game, which can be divided into several kind of subtypes. You've got your standard sword and board infantry, which are neither exceptional on the attack or melee defense side of things, they are just middle of the road and average. Then you've got axe infantry. One-handed axe infantry no longer are AP, but they do get a significant boost in damage, but in addition to that, they have a -2 melee defense penalty, so they are lower on melee defense than any of the other types of sword and board infantry. Moving on to mace infantry. Mace infantry have lower damage than a sword unit, but they do also have AP. In addition to that, they get a -1 penalty to their melee defense. So all of them can be used in different kinds of situations. You won't necessarily use mace infantry against high melee defense units, but you might want to use your axe infantry instead. It's all about picking your fights and kind of knowing what unit is going to be appropriate for what situation. Next, we have spear infantry. Spears have much improved in patch .95, and even low-tier spears pose a threat to heavy cavalry, and unless charging into a broken formation, cavalry in general should avoid spearmen whenever possible. In addition to which, spears suffer a -3 penalty, or -4, I can't remember which it is, against infantry units. Don't think this means that you can run over high-tier spearmen with low or mid-tier infantry, however. High-tier spears are more than capable of holding their own against lesser units of infantry. Next up, we have shock infantry. Much like their one-handed counterpart, shock infantry can be broken down into several subtypes. Of course, we have the two-handed swords, who are a balanced form of shock infantry. They have neither particularly high attack nor particularly low melee defense. Next up, we have maces, who, much like their one-handed counterparts, suffer from a -1 melee defense penalty, but also have AP. Finally, we have two-handed axes, who, unlike the one-handed counterparts, are in fact armor-piercing, but they still suffer a -2 melee defense penalty. Shock units are generally well used as support units, but you can also, of course, use them aggressively in the case of some of the less expensive, more expendable units of shock infantry. Dual-wielding units are another interesting subtype. They're not really shock infantry, they're not really sword and board either, because of course they don't have a shield, they use two weapons. So shock infantry get their full attack damage as their charge bonus. Dual-wielding units do not get that, however, but they are useful for a couple of reasons. One, they get a 20% melee and attack damage, melee defense, I should say, and attack damage buff because of their second weapon. Next up, we have polearms, and like many of the infantry units in the game, polearms come in a variety of different flavors. First, and I think most iconic, we have pike units. So pikes are very useful at dealing with cavalry, locking down choke points, and generally have a lot higher mass than a lot of the other polearm units. They've got, I believe, 3.5 base mass, with elven pikes having a little bit less. So very good as a defensive and as a support unit, and infantry that charges into the front of them will very easily find themselves skewered. So you're going to need a spear unit or something with shield wall to help you really push against pikes, or of course you'll need other counters like javelins, or depending on the kind of pike, other just regular bow skirmishers will do perfectly well. Next up, we have halberds. Halberds also have a bonus versus cavalry, much the same that pikes do, but they are AP. They've got less of a melee defense hit, but they don't have the same kind of, I want to say, zoning out power that a pike does. They don't have the same range of a pike. So pikes can definitely keep halberds at bay and poke them to death, but halberds, I think, are a little bit better suited to fighting other infantry units. And then finally, we have two-handed spear units, and there are very few of these in the game. I think there's only two, maybe three that I know off the top of my head, one of them being Fountain Guard, the other being Demons of the Desert, and the third escapes me at the moment. But they have very similar bonuses to pikes when it comes to anti-cavalry. They're definitely on par with the anti-cavalry bonus of certain spear bodyguards and things like that. But they don't have, I don't think they have the same amount of damage, and I don't think that they have the same amount of melee defense hit as well. I do believe that they get the spear penalty versus infantry, however, so they don't have the same kind of infantry killing power as, say, a halberd unit does. But one important thing to note about all of these halberds, and probably the most important trait of all, is the very long spears trait. Now, some people, I think this is associated only with pikemen, but indeed it is not. It is just a trait that allows that unit to reflect damage from the front when they are braced. So I don't know if it reflects part of the charge damage back at the enemy, or if it's the full charge damage, but units charging into the front of units with this trait, I believe one-handed spears have them as well, will take some damage, and they could potentially be catastrophic depending on the unit. Next up, we have Javelin Infantry. Javelin Infantry are strong against cavalry, but they are very vulnerable while setting up to fire. There is quite a significant delay between when a Javelin unit stops and when it can finally fire. Generally, they are quite lightly armored, though there are exceptions to this, like the Herenidine Troll Hunters, and of course they have very powerful AP missiles that can shred infantry or cavalry or anything that comes within range of them if they remain within their killing zone for too long. Next up, we have the Assassins, who are a species of light infantry. Now, there's not many factions that have them. There's only about 4, I believe, off the top of my head. And they are generally quite low in number, a little bit expensive, but they are high on damage and come equipped with their own special projectile. So every Assassin unit, I believe, has its own special projectile, with the exception of the Thieves of Tharbad, who do not have a projectile, but they are AP and melee, so it does kind of balance out a little bit. And now we move into bodyguards. Bodyguards can be broken down into 3 different types very broadly. You have aggressive bodyguards, so two-handed bodyguard units like, say, the LSR Honor Guard or the Champions of Nafarat for Harad, for example. And then you've got spear bodyguards, which have a higher than average spear bonus against cavalry. They get the same kind of cavalry bonus, I believe, that halberds get, which is 8, I believe, spear bonus. And then you've got support bodyguards, which are your ranged bodyguards, your bows and your javelins and so forth. And all of them do different things. They all have special traits, for the most part, I believe, that were made by Kuroguro-chan. The most prominent of which is the Spear Bodyguard trait, which gives a ton of morale to units around it in a very large radius. And the other units have some variation of that, but it's not to the same extent as the as the spear bodyguard, for example. So spear bodyguards are very useful in the front lines. A aggressive bodyguard is excellent for leading a charge, although of course there are risks associated with that, like your general being caught out in the middle of a melee and potentially cut down. And then you have your ranged bodyguards, which can be extremely useful for establishing range superiority. So if you're the elves, or if you are Gondor, for example, and you want to bring the Minas Ithil Rangers, I believe that's what they're called, then they can be very, very strong indeed. Next up, we have the light archers. They are numerous, plentiful, and cheap, and provide an excellent volume of fire. Next, we have heavy archers. As their name would suggest, heavy archers are very well armored, and as a consequence, quite resistant to arrows. They therefore have excellent survivability in a skirmish fight. However, shield arm units have their shield values cut in half unless they use them while firing. And that brings us to ranger units. Rangers are accurate, powerful in melee, with long range and high accuracy, and they can generally hide everywhere as well, making them excellent ambush units. They are, however, low in number, expensive, and generally quite lightly armored. It is very important to note that the Rangers use a custom projectile developed by Krogro-chan that gives them true body piercing, so it is possible for these units to hit multiple units with a single arrow, and this is at its best against units that are unshielded and relatively unarmored, and that is therefore the role that Rangers fulfill. They are great for thinning out chaff, not so great at going toe-to-toe with heavy archers or elven archers, for example. Next up, we have crossbows. Now, crossbows vary from your regular bog-standard archer in a number of different ways. First and most importantly is their AP damage. Most archers in the game do not have armor-piercing missiles. There are a few exceptions, though, to the tune of 3. There are the Temple Guard for Mordor, there's the Dale Dragon Slayers, and finally there are I believe they're the Wardens of the North now, not the Dunedain Bodyguard. They're the Wardens of the North for Arthedain. So crossbows have the ability to shoot armor-piercing missiles. However, they have significantly less ammunition than bow units and significantly shorter range as well. So they have to expose themselves much more than other skirmishers in order to be able to do their damage. That about wraps it up for the archers. Let's move on now to the cavalry. Cavalry is very much changed in patch 0.95, with several different subtypes of cavalry all making an appearance. The most common are the Lancer Cav. They are very deadly, they have an armor-piercing charge, and are by far the most common unit of cavalry in the game. They do, however, suffer a -3 penalty versus other cavalry units. Yes, that includes other Lancers. Next up, we have Melee Cav. Melee Cav are well armored and powerful against other cavalry. They do, however, have very low charge bonuses that are not AP, so they are not ideal for charging headlong into infantry. They will not have the same effect as your Lancer units. Depending on their tier, they have a +4, +7, +8 in the case of war, or +10 bonus versus cavalry. Next up, we have Spear Cav. Spear Cav strike a fine balance between Lancers and melee cavalry. They are not as good as other Lancers against infantry. They do have the same charge bonus, but because they are a spear unit, they do suffer from the -3 or -4 penalty that spear units get. They are, however, very deadly against other cavalry, as they have a spear bonus, the same spear bonus that infantry units have, and that helps cancel out their Lancer bonus. So they do also get, in addition to that, a +2 bonus versus horses, and do not suffer from the -3 penalty that other Lancers do. They're not as powerful in a sustained fight against melee infantry, as I said, and they are not quite as good against other cavalry as Melee Cav, but they are a nice balance. Finally, we have Knights. Knights are excellent versus other cavalry, deadly on the charge, 2 HP, however they are expensive and very few in number, so it is important to get the most out of your Knight units as possible. They are very much a fusion of Lancer and Melee Cav units, combining the high armor of Melee Cav with the high charge damage of Lancer units. And finally, we have Hybrids. Hybrids, very broadly, are just a fusion of 2 different types of units. So for example, the Red Shield of Erkenbrand that are available to Rohan are a hybrid bow skirmisher unit and melee cavalry unit. They can fulfill either role relatively well. Harlandon Guard, Forlandon Marines, and things like that are also really salient examples of hybrid units. Let's begin with the basics and arguably one of the most important parts of the patch and Total War in general, the army creation screen. Previously in 0.91, most factions had between 1 and 3 established comps, and there wasn't really a ton of variation outside of scenarios. In 0.95, however, the possibilities have been greatly expanded, and consequently, knowing how to build your army is more important than ever. Personally, I find that most army comps are at their best when balanced along 3 axes. First is opponent, the second is the counters to your opponent, and third and finally is the context, what kind of fight it is going to be. Let's take one of the more defensive, formation-dependent factions like the new Elves of Lindon for a spin against one of their natural predators, the rush-heavy faction of Gundabad. Now, one of Gundabad's big strengths is their heavy infantry and their ability to rush you down and break apart your line. So it is going to be important to have a lot of numbers moving into this fight. So for the time being, and we'll see where our funds lie at the end of this, we'll take a few units of Harlandon infantry, and we're going to back them up with some Forlandon pikes, which is pretty important. Now, it is to be assumed that these lines will balloon at some point. So a little bit of extra killing power to help you get through those formidable Gundabad defenses, especially those of the Blackwatch Legion, will be important. So in this case, I would take a couple units of Mithlon Swordmasters to give me a little bit of a hand with that. Now, as many of the Gundabad units are very heavily armored, it is important to have some AP on this roster, and units like the Forlandon Marines fill that niche quite nicely. One of the other things they're very good against is heavy cavalry, because they are hybrid units, so you can use them potentially to defend your flanks, but they're also good at killing trolls really quickly. A javelin volley or 2 is enough to kill almost the entirety of a troll unit. So having a bunch of these guys on hand to form a third line to your second line of swordmasters is an important thing to have going for you. Now, you are going to need some archers, but they might not be as useful against Gundabad, given that they are just going to push forward really quickly, and a lot of their units are fairly well armored anyway. So a couple units of Forlandon archers is really all that you'll need in this case, I think, to deal with the odd unit of Goblin trackers or Saga archers, depending on what the Gundabad player decides they want to bring. Now we get into the really cool units, like the Mithlon Marines, for example. We've got a fair amount of money left here, and we may not even need to have a lot of cavalry in this army. It might just come down to pretty much a straight infantry fight. You can expect Gundabad to bring units of cavalry. You can probably expect them to have a unit like the Witch Realm Inquisitors, for example, but having a large amount of javelins will help you deal with that pretty efficiently, especially the Forlandon Marines, who are very good at standing up to cavalry charges. So a couple other units there, the Mithlon Marines, to give you a little bit of extra mid-range skirmish, is going to be a big asset against Gundabad. And now we move into the kind of final picks here, which can be pretty important. Now we can bring a couple units of Noldoran Guard, which are really nice. They are locked morale as well. They inspire nearby troops and help keep your line anchored. So I think a couple units of them will be definitely useful for preventing any mass routes and the like. And now we've got a little bit of money left over, and we could bring another unit of Forlandon infantry, or this is Harlandon infantry, to try and pad out our line a little bit here. And that leaves us with 550. So what we could do is drop another one of those units, pop in another unit of the Forlandon pikemen, and then we've got way more money now to play around with and add a little bit more numbers to our cause. 875, we can get most of the things on the Lindon roster except for the truly elite picks and a lot of their cavalry. So this is obviously not going to be a very cavalry-heavy force. Now, this last pick, you can go either way, really. You could take another unit of Swordmasters if you want to, or if you want to have a little bit more range support, you could take some of these Forlandon archers. And you can see we've got nearly a full stack here of elves on a 13,000 budget, which is a lot of elves. Like, look at that, nearly 2,300 elves right there. And now you've got a lot of money left over for things like attack upgrades. Linda doesn't really get armor upgrades, but you can definitely give them attack upgrades to make them even more deadly in close quarters. So we're going to do that with our units that are going to see the most amount of fighting, and that being our frontline infantry. And then we'll see what we've got left over, and then maybe we can use it on some of our units like the Mithlon Swordmasters, for example. I find two-handed units really do benefit quite nicely from the extra attack damage, and it really is very useful for dealing with elite units. That extra damage can go a long way to getting through the high melee defense of certain elite units. So in this case, that's what we're going to do. And we've got one final little bit of money here. I'm going to use it to make our General's Bodyguard just a little bit more deadly. So what you have here is a composition that is going to be very dependent on how you, I would say, how you micro your missile units. You can beat Gundabad quite handily with this kind of an army, but it is going to be important to use your archers to either deal with their archers or to cut down their wargs. A unit of the Witch Realm Inquisitors all by themselves are not a terribly large threat when you've got this many AP missile units to throw around and use to defend your back lines. You've got enough of the Forlondon Marines here that you can use them on your front lines, or you can use them to defend your back lines and instead sub them in on the front lines with the Mythlond Marines, who do a lot of damage. I think they do a little bit more. Yeah, they have 1 more missile damage than the Forlondon Marines, so they might be a little bit better suited to being on your front lines. But your biggest kind of, I suppose, worry with this is not being able to deal with your enemy's cavalry and allowing them to get into your back lines and cause you a ton of problems. But you've definitely got a lot of infantry here, a lot of options in terms of keeping your front line very solid and not letting yourself be overwhelmed. And you've got reserves as well in the form of the Mythlon Swordmasters to try and deal with the natural ballooning that you're going to get when you have to run up against the Blackwatch Legion, especially when they're backed up with trolls. So this is the kind of army that I would potentially take in a 1v1 versus Gundabad. There are other options that you can go with, but this is just to give you a bit of an idea of how you kind of have to think about your army compositions when you approach just the patch generally. So let's move on now and take a look at the possibilities for fighting a Rudour army, which is definitely a big hurdle for the forces of Lindon. Let's move on to another potentially difficult fight for Lindon, that being Rudour. Following the same principles as Gundabad, Rudour is very focused on getting stuck into combat early, and also have a lot of javelin units and more cavalry options instead of high mass trolls or Blackwatch Legion. So they're not going to be busting through your lines with shielded armored units, they're just going to be picking them apart with their javelins. Now, unlike Gundabad, however, Rudour is not nearly so well armored. Now, against Rudour, the conventional style of Lindon warfare may not be the best approach. So, in this case, I would even opt to do something bold, and something you don't see the Elves of Lindon do very often. Rush them right back. You're expecting a rush, and you're expecting a ton of javelins. Use the same strategy against them. Rudour is very lightly armored, and it is definitely possible to overwhelm them. Especially if you can hit their front line really hard, open up those gaps in their lines, and then just use your superior elven units to break them apart and potentially even isolate them. It really depends on how you play it. Now, I'll explain it a little bit more as we go through the army comp. So this is what I would definitely try against Rudour, rather than opting for just letting them come to me and sitting back and trying to shoot. And there's a lot of risks to that. So what I would do is I would take units like the Forlondon Scouts, for example, who you can hide just about anywhere, and a unit of Noldoran Horse Lords. The Horse Lords are there to use their excellent charge bonus to run down Rudour infantry units before they manage to make it to your front line, but they're also an excellent counter to the Herenadine Nobles, who I would expect most Rudour players to bring if they're going to be making a rush army. There's definitely going to be some cavalry presence on the field in that kind of fight, just because it is needed to be able to defend their flanks. So 3 units of cavalry there. The Forlondon Scouts actually hit pretty hard, and they're not bad in melee. They do have decent skill as well. Their biggest drawback is their low numbers, and of course their low armor values, a meager armor value of 3. Now, Rudour is going to be bringing a lot of the Rudour warriors. That's what I would expect in any case, and probably some of their spearmen as well. But the Harlandon infantry are far superior to those units. A unit of Harlandon infantry can quite handily beat a unit of Rudour warriors, so I would bring the full complement of them. In addition to which, I would bring some reserves here in the form of the Mythlon Marines, who can be used to support the front lines and give as good as they get with the Rudour javelin units. But I would go one step further and bring 3 Forlondon Marines as well. That's a lot of javelins, easily as many javelins as Rudour is going to be able to field with the kind of rush army that I would expect Rudour to bring against Lindon. And that leaves us with a fair amount of money left over, so we can invest that in a few ways. We could bring some Forlondon archers, like that. 1 or 2 units, like a vestigial force of archers, just to support our lines is always a good thing to have. And then we've got a couple options here. We could bring 2 units of the Noldoran Guard to lend us some pretty decent staying power on the battle line. They are locked morale, and they inspire nearby units, so they won't rout quite so easily. Not that the Elves of Lindon will rout terribly easily. They do have morale that is on the higher end, but that is an option. But you've got a few other things that you can do as well. You can bring more numbers. You can bring 3 units of Forlondon pikemen, which you'll want to keep back because they will get focused down by javelins early on. Otherwise, if you have them on your front lines, although they are a little bit slower, just because they are pike units. You can see their speed is just a tiny bit slower than the average. Let's see. Yeah, than the average Lindon infantry unit. So maybe that won't be best suited for your purposes, but it really depends on kind of how I guess you want to approach the battle. I could see them being useful as a third reserve line, basically. Once your Harlandon infantry and your Forlandon Marines and your Mythlon Marines have all been expended, these guys can be brought in to poke holes in the enemy lines and things like that, and just shore up any place where they need to be. You could also bring a couple units of the Swordsmen as well, which are definitely very useful. They're a little bit more lightly armored, but they have a lot of damage behind them, and it does leave you with a ton of money left over for upgrades, although you probably won't be able to spend that much, so in this case, I wouldn't take the Mythlon Swordmasters. Finally, you could bring a unit here of the Noldoran Blade-Masters, and, ooh, no, you can't get one of those, but you could get a unit of the Harlandon Guard as well, add a little bit more ranged firepower to your line, although I would expect the Noldoran Blade-Masters to get focused down very, very early on, so it may not be the best approach in this particular instance if you're going to be counter-rushing Rudour and charging yourself into the teeth of their javelins. So for me personally, I would bring a couple units of Noldoran Guard and hold them back, and only use them when my line, if my line begins to fall apart, use them in kind of crisis situations. But you definitely got a lot of numbers here, nearly 2,000 Elves of Lindon, which is very, very nice. And you're a little bit more aggressive and kind of fighting Rudour at their own game, because Mythlon has the option, at least in my opinion, to do that. They've got a lot of javelins, and they've got some nice range firepower as well. Then you've got your cavalry wing covered that you can use either offensively in charges, which is probably a good idea early on, or you can use them to counter enemy cavalry on the wings and things like that. And speaking of cavalry, you've got the Forlandon Marines, of course, who double as a spear unit. Now, one final roster adjustment that you could make is to have one unit of Noldoran Guard and another unit of Harlandon Guard if you feel you need more spears, but personally, yeah, I would stick with the 2 units of the Noldoran Guard. And then you've got upgrades to consider. Now, I don't usually like to give upgrades, like attack upgrades, to units I think are going to be focused down, and the Elves of Lindon don't get armor upgrades, so your only option is attack upgrades, and I don't always like to give it to units that I think will be annihilated very quickly, and I think that that's a possibility for Harlandon infantry in this case. So I gave it to them last time against Gundabad because I knew they'd be in the thick of the heavy fighting and things like that, because Gundabad doesn't make units disappear the same way that Rudour does. But in this case, I would give it to my Mythlon Marines because they're being held back as reserve units. I would also give it to my Noldoran Guard for that same reason. And then finally, we've got some options here. I would give this to my Forlandon Marines because I know that these guys will die quickly, but I want them to inflict the most damage that they possibly can in a short period of time, and so giving them a little bit of extra attack boost really does help them do that. Now we've got 2 final upgrades to make here, first of which I would give to the Noldoran Guard. They're definitely going to need it. They will be in the thick of the fighting, and they're fast enough to be able to potentially avoid javelin units and things like that, so it's not a bad investment in that case. And we've got one final little attack upgrade here that we can use pretty well anywhere. I would give it to the Forlandon Archers instead of the Mythlon Marines, or the Forlandon Marines rather, because these are spear units at their core, and spear units do have a passive debuff against other infantry. I think it's like -3 or -4 or something like that, so it is pretty significant. So I'd give that to Forlandon Archers. I think it'll just go a little bit farther. But yeah, there you have it, a counter rush build to Rudour that in a 1v1 situation could potentially work, but it is definitely a tough matchup for Lindon in any case. But in any case, that's the end of this particular section of the video, so let's move on now to something a little bit different. So that covers your opponents and potential counters to their strengths and how to play up your own strengths while minimizing your weaknesses. Let's talk a little bit about the third axis, that being context. 1v1s are all well and good, but what happens if we expand the scope of the game? Is it a 2v2, a 3v3, or a free-for-all? Let's operate from the assumption that we're going into an FFA game with 3 other players. When building an army, you have to think about more than just what one player might bring, but all of them at once. I find that the trick to these kinds of games is having a full deck of cards. A lot of different units that can all counter something that your enemies might bring, but still work together as a unified force. Let's assume we're going to a game with the Dwarves, Rohan, and Mirkwood, a potentially tough match indeed for the Elves of Lindon. Alright, now since we are going to be facing Rohan, of course we're going to need to have at least a little bit of cavalry. Now we may take a similar approach to what we did with the Rudour forces, where we opt for some of the more cheaper units that can be a little bit more cost effective. And I think that I would do that in this case as well. So I'd bring a couple units there, the Forlandon Scouts, that I can use for ambushes, or potentially even to catch horse archers out in the field, and things like that, although of course you want to be very, very careful with how you use these guys, because against Rohan horse archers, the scouts can fall away really, really quickly. But the Noldor Horse Lords are going to be there because there may be some Sons of Eorl in the field, and you're definitely going to need some knights to counter the Rohirrim knights, otherwise you can find yourself in a really, really difficult position very quickly. Also, if we're playing against the dwarves, if it happens to be the dwarves of Erebor, for example, they will have the Hammer Guard on the field, and a high skill unit like the Noldor Horse Lords are going to be very, very strong against the slightly lower end damage, but AP that the Hammer Guard can put out. Now, it's going to be important to try and economize a little bit here. So we're going to have a modest front line of 3 units of the Harlandon infantry. I would even experiment with between 2 and 3 units of the Harlandon Marines, because they're both useful for defending your flanks, and also just useful to have that extra AP on your line if you're going to be fighting the dwarves. Now, we run into the problem of Mirkwood. They are very, very good against the Elves of Lindon. They've got high accuracy, high missile damage, and the Elves of Lindon are naturally very lightly armored. So, we want to try and minimize this as much as possible, and that is going to come in the form of 2 units of Harlandon Guard, who are going to be quite important for dealing with the Elves of Mirkwood. They do have a little bit extra defense in the form of their 5 shield values, so that will help them stay alive a bit longer against those very deadly Mirkwood archers. I would also bring a unit of Wardens of Elastirion, because they can go blow for blow with a lot of the Mirkwood archers, depending on how heavy they go on their skirmish line. These guys will do really, really well. And then we've got nearly 3k left to play with. So that's a pretty solid core to our army that answers a lot of our needs in the battle. So we could take a couple units here of the Mithlond Marines, or we could take 1 unit of Mithlond Marines and a couple units of Noldoran Guard. Or we could go for a unit of the Forlindon Marines and still have enough left over for a couple units of the Noldoran Guard, which is pretty useful. In addition to which, we could even expand our front line even further. A couple more units here of the basic Forlindon units, which gives us a lot of nice numbers and a big solid front line to defend. And then that leaves us with about 900 left, which is not quite enough for one of the elite Noldoran Guard, nor is it enough for any of the other elite units like the cavalry and things like that. But it does give us an option for another Mithlond Marine, for example, which could be really, really useful, or potentially even another unit of Harlandon infantry. So if you want to go for more of an elite approach, I would bring the Mithlond Marines, if you feel that you need a little bit more of that mid-range skirmish, or you could go for a unit of Forlindon Archers, for example, just to give yourself a little bit more ranged firepower. It's really up to you how you want to spend that last 900 florins, but I think that this would be a really good army moving into an FFA game, where you've got a multiplicity of different threats that you have to deal with in different ways. So to summarize everything that we've learned, who is your opponent? What are their strengths? How do they stack up against yours, and what are they likely to bring? How do you counter their strengths, and finally, what kind of fight is this going to be? With all of these factors in your head, you'll have a very clear strategy of what you need to do in order to win, or at least to put up a pretty good fight. Let's move on to some basic tactics that I've used with some success and that I've seen the testers use throughout the testing process. First is combined arms. Mixing units together to cover for another's weaknesses is a big part of being successful in 0.95. Gone are super units that can fill multiple roles, so now the gap needs to be filled by unit stacking. A basic version of this is mixing in pikes, halberds, or spear infantry in with your main line sword and board infantry, which can help deter lancer charges from the front that would otherwise flatten a unit of elite infantry, causing you to lose a lot of investment and a lot of your killing power. Next up, we have rushing, which is something that we talked about pretty well at length in this video, but I never really went into detail about what exactly a rush is. Rushing is more than just running in a straight line and hoping for the best. You need to have micro in order to accomplish a rush successfully. Rushes need to be coordinated in order for them to be powerful. That means that cav on the wings is an important feature of a rush, and a second unit, or second line rather, of support units to help out the infantry if they get into trouble. Cavalry needs to be not far enough forward to be immediately singled out by missile units, but also not far enough behind that they can't support infantry when needed, which is the same for the missile units. Of course, you don't want to have them too far away from your lines, because then they are isolated and easy prey for any enemy cavalry that may be roving around. Third and finally, we have concentration of force, or corner crushing if you prefer. Instead of engaging the entirety of an enemy army, you can always pick a spot on the line and attack it with everything you have. Overwhelming a single point on an enemy line rather than engaging the length and breadth of it can be a powerful tool for dislodging heavily entrenched defenders and allowing yourself not to take horrendous casualties in the process of grinding down your enemy. It is very much recommended, however, that you have reserves and don't commit every single unit you have to one attack. Of course, you want to have some units that keep the rest of the enemy line from swinging around and encircling you, which would be disastrous for your army. And with that, we conclude our strategy guide for 0.95. Hope you guys found this useful. It by no means covers every single detail that there is to be had in 0.95. It's not completely comprehensive, but I hope that it is enough to get you started and to get you situated in the new game that is 0.95. In any case, my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye!